Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And as you can see, we're out and about on our travels once again. And today, we've made the journey from Scotland to Kendal to cover the 2024 Wulfsport Taylor Trophy Scramble. Now, this event is, of course, hosted by the very well-respected Westmoreland Motor Club, who have been putting on trials, scrambles and even hill climb events in and around this area for the last 100 years or so. So when it comes to putting on one of these classic scrambles, then the Westmoreland Motor Club are certainly the guys to turn to. Now, this racetrack here at Helsington does, of course, have a bit of history behind it, because I'm sure that this track was used as a scrambles venue way back in the 1950s or 60s, and it's only just recently been resurrected by the Westmoreland Motor Club just a few years ago. So they're looking forward to seeing these off-road bikes taking to this iconic racetrack once again. Now, with regards the race format for Sunday, now I don't actually have any information with regards the classes and the amount of races that there's going to be held on the Sunday, but I'm assuming that it's going to be at least 20 plus races on the day. So we've quite a lot of bikes and racing to get through before the end of this weekend. But before we do that, of course, we have to take our usual walk around the paddock. So let's do that right now and have a look at some of these bikes that are soon to take part in this 2024 Helsington Classic Scramble. Now, that little introduction there was actually filmed on the Saturday prior to race day, and at that time many of the riders still had their bikes hidden away in their various transporters, and there wasn't really any bikes that I could actually capture on the Saturday, so I then had to wait until Sunday morning to do my paddock stroll. But as usual, the weather went from what was quite nice and sunny outlook to a wet and overcast day, which only really got worse during the day, and it was quite late in the morning before any bikes actually came out of hibernation. So I had approximately an hour and a half before practice started to try and cram in as many bikes as I could during that short space of time. But this here was my 5-star accommodation for the weekend at Helsington, because as you know, we spare no expense here on CDB TV when it comes to luxuries on our channel. But as you can imagine, it's no laughing matter sleeping in one of these small tents when it's absolutely pissing down with rain. And even Steve and Joseph Dent here were making sure that their little CR125 Hondas were well protected from the elements by using a pair of umbrellas to keep that dreaded rain at bay, because even at 8 o'clock in the morning it was a damp and quite miserable start. Right, so our first bike is this quite nice 1965 BSAB 44500, and this little beauty here belongs to Craig Holmes, and this is just one of 2 bikes that Craig will be racing on the day with his other big Michael, which we'll take a look at in a minute. Now, originally this bike here was owned and built by ex-CCM Works rider and fellow Scotsman, I might add, the legendary Jimmy Aird. Now, this is a bike that Jimmy actually had up for sale at the 2022 Telford show, when Craig then spied it and made an offer to Jimmy for its purchase. Now, Craig told me that he's continually making constant improvements to the bike since he bought it from Jimmy, and he's more or less now quite content with the way that the bike handles, and he's especially happy with the performance of this big BSA B44 motor, and you can see some nice custom graphics as well there on that alloy fuel tank, which was more or less a standard fitment on many of these old BSE Victors from the 1960s. So up here at the front of Craig's BSE, I think it's a pair of Maxton forks, but of course all manner of front suspensions could be fitted to these old BSE Victors back in the day. And when we move to the bike's rear suspension here, it's a very high quality pair of Swedish Öhlins classic shocks, and these gas and oil filled Öhlins will be more than adequate to sort out the back end of our classic BSA. And of course, as they say in TV terms, there are many other suspension systems also available, and many of them are certainly a good match for these classic Swedish Öhlins. But for general off-road use, these Swedish suspension systems still do a very good job. So you can look out for Craig riding this bike in the pre-68 class alongside many of the other vintage pre-68 bikes, of which there were very many at Helsington this year, as you'll soon find out. But again, despite the bike having those black wheels, it's still a proper old school scrambler, and it's certainly one that's quite quick on the track. So that's our first vintage classic of the day. That's Craig Holmes's 1965 BSA B44 500. Right, so this is Craig's other race bike. This is his 1982 490 Michael, which was one of literally hundreds of German Michaels that were littering the Helsington Paddock this year. Now, this bike here of Craig's, he told me, was an ex-Dick Doo racing machine, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct in saying that it was at one time ridden by American racing legend John Dowd, the junkyard dog, who at one time raced this bike at the famous Farley Castle racetrack as part of the Vets at the Nations Motocross a few years ago. But once again, an absolutely awesome piece of kit with that 490 reed valve motor, which, as you know, was the follow-up to the highly successful Mega 2 from 1981. And this engine here, of course, has the gear-driven crank and clutch, as opposed to the old rattly primary chain that was used to connect the crankshaft and the clutch together on the older 81 engine. So I expect that this reed valve powerhouse will have enough grunt to propel Craig around the track when he races this bike in the Twin Shock Open 60 plus category as part of the day's race programme. And you can see more Michael personalisation here on the fuel tank with these quite snazzy graphics advertising Craig's motorcycles in Dewsbury in West Yorkshire. But as I remember from race day, this was quite a quick bike on the track, as of course are all of these 490s, if you just take the time to set them up right and put the right pilot in the driving seat. But it still continues to amaze me how aged 60 plus riders can still ride two different bikes in two different classes, because I used to think that I did quite well when I rode my own 440 Michael in just 3 races while I was still in my 40s, and even then that felt like it was 2 races, far too many. So you can see by looking at both of these bikes, Craig's certainly got his hands full when racing gets underway, because he's going to have to be a very busy man while he's jumping from that old British B-44 BSA onto his Michael 490 rocket ship. But this was another nice classic Michael that I spotted in the deepest corners of the paddock, and this is a 1978 400, and another little blast from the past, because I think these old Michaels, as I remember, were still quite good bikes for their day, and they had quite a good strong steel chassis, and again as a second hand used by these bikes were an excellent choice if you wanted to get into twin shock racing, and if you couldn't lay your hands on the more desirable Mega 2 490 from 81, then these 1978 or even the 1979 models were still a very good substitute, because both the 78s and the 79s had similar handling characteristics. But as you can see, this bike here is quite a decent example of one of these 78 400s. It's not, of course, got all of its original parts. It's still bolted onto it, as you can see, but that's only to be expected on a bike that's now coming up for 46 years old. But again, the piston port two-stroke motor, almost identical to the engine that I had in my own 1980 440 from back in the day, which was a fantastic motor. Not as brutal, of course, as the big Mega 490, but certainly a much more sedate and rider friendly engine. But this old German racer certainly still appears to have its stock front end from that year, but that exhaust expansion chamber, of course not the original, but it's a DEP replacement, which again is quite common to see on these older Michaels, because the original pipes did tend to suffer quite a lot of punishment down the years. But you can see that this 78 has had a replacement set of wheels, whereby the original items have now been swapped for a pair of alloy ACR Talon items. And to add to that replacement expansion chamber, it's also got a replacement rear tailpipe, which again is from Elwell pipes. But there were certainly numerous different models and other interpretations of these German Michaels at Helsington this year, and I just can't help thinking about how clubs haven't actually started up a Michael race series as yet, because there's no shortage of these kind of bikes or even interest in them. But this old 78 model here was without doubt one of the quite nicer examples that I came across on the day, as I quickly made my way around the paddock just to try and grab as many bikes as I could in the very short space of time I had available. But this next bike was another lovely machine I spotted, and this is Neil Calderbank's 1978 HL 500 Aberg 4-stroke Yamaha. And I do remember Neil telling me on the day that this bike here had one of the original Profab frames, which, as I'm sure you're already aware, was the company that took the original Holman and London Husqvarna chassis and then used it as a template to build a brand new frame to host the big XT 500 single 4-stroke engine, to eventually, of course, create a brand new brand of motorcycles that they were going to be called the HL 500 Yamaha, with the HL abbreviation being based on Holman and London, who of course had the initial idea to put together this brand new concept off-roader. Now, as I remember, the original HL Yamahas were fitted with Fox air shocks on the rear, and other parts like the bike's front forks and wheels and brakes were normally just taken straight from Yamaha's YZ400 two-stroker motocross machine. But very few of the original HL 500s are actually still around, because there weren't that many actually made in the first place, with I think it was just a few hundred that were said to be constructed. So most of these HLs that you do come across nowadays are basically more or less copies or replicas of the original Holman and London racers, because back in the day, Profab would actually build you a chassis, and then it was up to you to try and find and put together all the remaining parts that you needed to bolt onto the frame to complete the bike. So the big HL's power plant was based around Yamaha's XT500 Enduro engine, which I think in its standard stock form pumped out around a 30 or so horsepower, but of course once all of the tuning and modifications were completed, they could then crank out, I think it was around the 50 plus horsepower range, and it turned this big 500 single cylinder four banger from what was a pretty mundane and dull four-stroke plodder into what eventually turned out to be a very reliable and highly competitive power plant that was more than capable of taking on the very best of the current two-strokers that were dominating motocross during the late 1970s and early 80s. And as I mentioned earlier, the original Holman and London Yamahas did have a pair of Fox air shocks bolted onto the back, and other copies down the years had various makes and configurations of twin shocks at the rear. And Neil's example, as you can see here, has what looks like a pair of Swedish-made Öhlin piggyback units, which certainly were the most popular as a rear setup suspension system. Now, there were two different kinds of alloy swing arms fitted to these HLs during 78 and 79, and our example here certainly appears to have the correct swing arm for the 78 bike, with that banana style kink there at the end, whereby the later 79 machine had a similar alloy swing arm, but it was just a straight unit without the twist at the end. But moving on to the bike's front forks now, as far as it looks, these forks on Neil's bike certainly look like they're Yamaha units, but from which model of machine I don't actually know, but they do look like they're maybe from a much later model Yamaha, although the bike still has retained its original Yamaha wheels and hubs at the front and at the rear. Now, I'll wager that there's quite a decent grille that will come from this big megaphone tailpipe when that big 500 four-stroke Yamaha engine gets fired into life. But normally when the original Holman and London bikes were built, they used the much smaller and slimmer fuel tanks taken from the little YZ 125 Yamaha two-strokers, which of course gave this big four-banger a very unique look. But this is still a belter of a bike from Neil Calderbank, and as I said, it's not your diamond find of one of the original HL Yamahas, which, as you know, are few and far between these days, with just that very small few actually manufacturers. So it's no surprise that you don't see them nowadays. But this is still a fine bike without a doubt, and certainly one to look out for on the track when Neil lines the bike up on the start line in the Twin Shock Open aged 45 plus category. Okay, so next up, it's a brief look at a couple of classics from John Sinnott, and these are John's CZ and Honda Red Rockets. So let's just begin with John's Czechoslovakian CZ, which is a 1973 250. Another quite nice example of one of these very quick Czechoslovakian racers. And once more, not a fully stock bike from that year, because you can't expect a 51-year-old dirt bike to still have all of its original factory bits and pieces intact. And John has quite a good reputation for his preparation and maintenance, and he does take a lot of time to keep his bikes running in tip-top condition, as you can easily see here. But again, this 250's been removed of that old troublesome original Jikov carburetor in favour of this much more efficient Mikuni item. And further upgrades on John's 250 of course include the now very popular gear shifter linkage, which eliminates that long throw that you used to get between shifting gears on these old Czechoslovakian engine. Now, the bike's exhaust is once more a new replacement for the original. I think this pipe here looks like it could be one of those upgraded pipes that you can source from Holland, which is usually just a straightforward replacement for the bike's original. And here we have the iconic alloy fuel tank, which I'm sure John told me was actually from a different model of CZ, because I'm sure the stock tanks for the 73 bikes were all held onto the chassis by using a simple leather strap and buckle. And here at the front end of the bike, it certainly looks correct for its year, but to be fair, these CZs are another bike that there are so many different upgraded parts now available to make them run and handle better, and that's another reason that makes them so popular as a two-stroke racer, because getting parts original or pattern isn't a problem. So that's a short introduction there to John's immaculately turned out CZ racer from 1973. So as you can see, John's another one of those very lucky riders who not only has two bikes to ride at this event, he appears to have the energy to do it as well. And this is his second machine, and this is his 1979 250 Honda Red Rocket. And this is a bike that he'll be racing in the Twin Shock Open aged 60 plus category, which is naturally the age of the rider and not the age of the bike. But we've already covered the basics and the background on these Honda Red Rockets in various other videos here on my channel, but it's suffice to say that when Japan introduced these 250 rockets into the UK in the late 1970s, many of the popular European Bultacos and Maicos and Husqvarnas saw their sales figures slump because riders were just rushing to swap, sell or even trade in their old European race bikes for one of these more desirable Honda Red Rockets. And this little fire engine red 250 two-stroke Honda motor was without doubt the beating heart of these Red Rockets. It was an absolute peach of an engine that had all you needed from an off-road motorcycle power plant, because it was light, it was compact, it was powerful, and because it was Japanese built, it was very well engineered and super reliable. So just like our earlier two bikes of Craig Holmes's BSA and Michael, you can imagine that John's going to be a very busy man while he's jumping from his 1973 CZ onto his 250 Honda Red Rocket. So I expect that John will eat a very hearty breakfast beforehand to give him all of the energy he'll need. Now, just before we move on to our next featured bike, a quick mention here about our guest of honour at this year's Helsington Classic, Scramble, who is none other than the legendary off-road motorcycle photographer Eric Kitchen. Now, Eric back in the day was a successful trials rider before picking up a camera and taking snaps at local scrambles, trials and other off-road events all over the UK, and he was a constant supplier of pictures for the British-based publication the Trials and Motocross News. And as you'd expect, Eric's images have been in very high demand throughout the years and have been used in many various books and magazine publications. And actually I did manage to meet the great man a few years back, but Eric's archive of images does have a huge historical value, as you'd imagine, and even at aged 91 and the guest of honour at Helsington this year, he was still working hard and snapping away, taking photos of the riders on the track. So a very worthy guest of honour to have at this year's Helsington Classic Scramble event. Right, so next up it's Gary Morley's 1981 Yamaha YZ250, another quite good original example of one of these super popular and very quick Japanese evolution bikes. And Gary's 250 certainly appears to have most of its stock 1981 parts still intact. Now, I think I'm correct in saying that these 81s were designated the 250H models, and Gary's bike here is, of course, the European spec YZ with its red, white and black livery, as opposed to the international American spec bikes with their yellow plastics and black graphics. But if you were in the market for a good, reliable, fast and good handling crosser in 1981, then these YZs were certainly up there with one of the best bikes that you could buy at the time. Now, here at the back of these YZ250s, you had Yamaha's superb Monocross swing arm and rear suspension setup, which certainly worked a treat with that single rear shock that ran underneath the bike's seat and fuel tank, and the gas and oil filled reservoir for that rear shock was of course placed here at the front of the bike's chassis, where it could be cooled by the onrushing air when the bike was out there on the track. But this was a tried and tested rear suspension system that at the time appeared to work quite well. Now, the YZ's motor was, of course, a reed valve 250 two-stroke with Yamaha's YEIS induction system, or Yamaha Energy induction system, if you want to give it its full title. But it was a belter of an engine that had a 5-speed gearbox, so it certainly had more than enough cogs to keep your left foot dancing all the way to the finish line. Now, the clutch again was your multi-plate oil-cooled affair, but this entire engine from spark plug to sump plug was near enough a dirt bike racer's dream, because it had very little in the way of vices or mechanical problems. And with regards to the front end on these 81 YZs, I'm pretty sure it was a pair of 43mm Kayawas that were bolted on to this front end, which I think gave the rider just under that 12 inches of movement to play with. But this bike here of Gary Morley's is certainly a good example of an 81 250, and this was just your starter for 10 for the many more YZs that filled the paddock. because sitting right next to Gary's bike was this almost identical machine, and this is Adam Wimpiney's 81 250, another nice looking YZ rocket ship, which just goes to prove how healthy the 250 racing class is in this part of the country, because the paddock at Helsington this year was awash with little 125 and 250 bikes, so it appears that there's plenty enthusiasm for riders wanting to race these smaller bore machines, and this bike here of Adam's is another little cracker. And moving on to the business end of the bike again, we have that iconic Reidvalder two-stroke 250 motor, which, as I remember, in 1980, I think this engine had a 6-speed gearbox, but for these 81s, Yamaha then moved them back to a 5-speed on this engine, but beefed up all of the gears to make them more robust and stronger. But just at the top of your picture there, you can see Yamaha's YEIS boost bottle just above the engine's cylinder head. So quite a nice pair of YZ250s there from Gary Morley and Adam Wimpiney, who will be competing these bikes in the Twin Shock 250 class, even although these of course are single rear shock bikes. They're still eligible to race alongside Twin Shockers, virtue of the fact that these bikes have non-linkage rear suspension, air-cooled motors and old-school drum brakes on the front and at the rear. Right, so next up it's a collection of 125 RM Suzuki Scramblers, and the number 151 bike there is Mark Silverton's race bike, and the number 168 is Richie Hunter's. But these little 125s, and not only these RM Suzukis, but other bikes like the CR125 Hondas are once more very popular due to the relatively new air-cooled 125 championship that's currently running here in the UK, which is proving to be very popular, and it's not unusual to see a full gate of these 125s when they line up at the start line. And here at Helsington in 2024 there was another massive assortment of 125s for this event. So this bike here that we're looking at is Mark Silverton's RM, that has that nice replacement alloy fuel tank, and this is a 1980 model, but again not the original that you'd find in your dealer shop window 44 years ago, because it does have a few nice little trick bits and pieces screwed onto it. And the other machine in this trio is this number 168 example, which of course is Richie Hunter's 1979 bike, which I do know is a very quick machine, because I've already seen this bike buzz around the racetrack, and just like Mark's bike, it also has a few upgrades to improve the bike's performance and overall handling and engine power. But the first thing that you're drawn to is this a replacement alloy cylinder head, which I think back in the day was quite a common upgrade on these smaller RM 125s, which I expect was fitted to increase compression and reduce some weight, and also to help dissipate heat more efficiently than the stock standard Suzuki item. But it still never ceases to amaze me the amount of power that you can get from these very small and compact 125s when you see them on the track. Now, there was a third little RM125 in this Suzuki threesome lineup, and this number 686 machine belonged to Gary Colonel, and this is Gary's 1980 model. And as I mentioned, there was no shortage of 125s this year at Helsington, because I think this was the final round of the 2024 Twin Shock 125 Championship. So there was an abundance of riders and bikes who were racing for final championship points, just to try and win some silverware for their hard work throughout the season. So these three musketeers of Richie Hunter, Mark Silverton and Gary Collinall, were all comparing notes and talking tactics of how they were all going to finish when the dust finally settled and the 125 Championship was done and dusted for another year. So there you have it, a nice little collection there of RM 125s. So next up we have another nice looking Swede, and this bike here is Chris Trotton's 1973 250 CR Husqvarna. Not too many of these 250s going around these days. They're becoming a bit few and far between with regards seeing them still racing on the track, because I think most of these old Swedish classics tend to be confined to museums or maybe private bike collections these days. But thankfully there are still a few owners, including Chris of course, who still use them as a weekend race bike at classic events such as this one here at Helsington. Now, when these 1973 Huskies came out in that year, the bikes were said to be about as near as a rider could afford to the works Heikki Mikkola race bikes of its time, and the engine did have some quite nice innovations, namely the motor's casings were all made from lightweight magnesium, and when they were running, these engines did sound a bit rattly, and even at times they did sound like they were maybe going to self-destruct at any minute. But these 250s were still reasonably powerful and generally reliable for a 1970s 250. But this example here of Chris's appears to still have its original high-level exhaust expansion chamber, but the stock Bing carburetor has been swapped for a much more modern Mikuni. And the bike's rear shocks, as you'd expect, aren't the originals, which is no surprise on a bike that's now over 50 years old. And actually, having said that, our little Husky here still looks like it has many of its factory parts from when it was put together in 1973. Although, to be fair, these 250s did perform well on the track, and more or less everything on these 73s worked as it should, because it did have a quite good, strong and light 4130 steel chassis, and it also had a decent engine that had reed valve induction and a 5-speed gearbox. And at the front and the rear suspensions, of course, weren't up to modern day standards, but for 1973 the bike had the suspension technology of its time, which of course wasn't great, but for your average club rider it was perfectly adequate. Anyhow, this is a fine example of a 73 250 CR Husqvarna, and it's still good to see one being raced on the track. So look out for Chris racing this bike in the pre-1974 up to 250 class. Now, you just may remember that I mentioned that there were an abundance of 125s at Helsington this year, and these RM 125s in particular, and it seemed that there was an RM at almost every turn when you wandered around the paddock. But this one here was without doubt one of the best on the day, and this example here is Mark Sheldon's immaculate 1980 RM 125, which was a cracking looking machine, and again not a fully original bike, but a superb example of one of these yellow RM screamers. But I certainly don't want to dwell too much on these 125s, but the fact is that there were a very high percentage of these smaller CC bikes taking part in the 125 Championship this year, and it was quite hard not to notice them in what was, on the day, an almost 200 riders who had entered to take part in this Wulfsport Taylor Trophy Scramble event, and these smaller 125s certainly did make up a substantial percentage of the entrants. But I must say, this example here of a 1980 RM125 is about as good as I've seen for quite some time, and as far as I'm aware, I don't think that Mark's actually in the running to win any silverware in this year's championship, but I'll bet you that he has some great fun when he's taking on all of the other 125s in either the Twin Shock A or Twin Shock B classes. And once more, as is normal for these smaller CC motocrossers, it was still old school drum brakes as the bike's stoppers, and here at the back it's a decent pair of YSS piggyback shocks, which are perfectly suited to these lighter Twin Shock 125 racers. But this bike here was just one of the many 125s that were ready to take to the track here at Helsington, and of course you can see Mark's bike and a host of others battling it out on the track when I eventually get around to posting all of the racing highlights from this 2024 event. So another belter of a bike there from Mark Sheldon. Okay, so just to finish off our paddock walkabout from Helsington 2024, let's take a very brief look at Mike Foster's 1976 370 Bultaco Persang, another not so common bike to find at classic scrambles nowadays, although back in the 1970s these Persangs were hugely popular, not only here in the UK but of course all across Europe as well, and that was the days before the Japanese invasion with their mass-produced, faster, cheaper, and some would even say better engineered motorcycles. But with regards to this 370 two-stroke motor, I do remember as a much younger man having a quick go on one of these 370 Bultacos, and to say the least I was reasonably impressed by its power and speed, but then again, only having had ridden British-built motorcycles to compare it with, this Bultaco engine was, to me, like outer limits high tech as far as I was concerned. Although for their time, if you could put a decent rider on one of these Persangs that knew how to ride them, then these Bultacos could certainly still be a highly competitive package, even for the 1970s. So you can see that this bike here of Mike Foster's is yet another quite good example, and even looks like an almost original bike from 1976, and I've certainly come across a few of the smaller 250 Persangs in the past, but I have to say that this is one of the first 370s I've seen in quite some time. Now, all of these bikes that you've had a look at in this video were only a very small percentage of the hundreds of classic machines that littered the paddock at this year's 2024 Helsington Classic Scramble, and we've actually kept back one or two bikes to show you in another feature at a later date. So look out for those bikes coming up on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a look at some of those quite nice looking classics from around the paddock. That of course was just a very small sample of the many bikes that you can take a look at when we eventually get around to posting all of the racing footage, but there was a nice collection of old classics in that particular clip, so I do hope you've enjoyed taking a look at them. Now the next up of course will be all of the racing footage from this 2024 Helsington Classic Scramble, so if you're not already subscribed to CDB TV, then maybe you'll do that very small thing, because that way if you subscribe to the channel you won't miss out on any future videos that I post. So I'm away now for a well-earned beer, and I've been told that I can only have one, so this is my beer here in the background, so hopefully that'll keep me going until we get round to filming all of the racing footage. So from all of us here at the Helsington Classic Scramble 2024, until the next time, it's goodbye for now.